welcome to everybody. Before they run away, thank you very much for the help to Julia and Sandra. Thank you to the organizer, Veronica Bennett, of the research seminar. And first and foremost, thank you to Lisa Herzog for accepting the invitation. She's extremely busy. Among other things, she's Dean of Studies of the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen. We know that means a lot of work. Professor Herzog works at the interface between political theory and economic thought. She's actually, for some years now, she's running a center dedicated to philosophy, politics, and economics at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen, apart from being the Dean of Studies. She did her PhD at the University of Oxford when she was researcher there as well. And she's editor of the Review of Social Economy. It's a very interdisciplinary journal. And her last monograph, an interdisciplinary monograph, actually is called Citizen Knowledge Markets, Experts, and the Infrastructure of Democracy, which actually combines not only economic thought and political theory, but also social science, political epistemology, and so on and so forth. So this was published with Oxford University Press, and today Lisa is going to talk about one of her key interests, key focuses on the question of work from the perspective of democratizing economics, basically from a Wittgensteinian perspective. So that's pretty exciting. I'm very curious to see how you're going to combine, the intuitions and this famous debate about rule following of one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, with debates that are burning right now: the future of work, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Without further ado, thank you very much for being here. So we have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a talk that brings together quite different things. And it's a talk that is sort of pessimistic. So I very much hope that you have lots of good counter-arguments. Who of you uses AI in their daily lives? Well, who of you is sometimes being managed by AI? So you have to do work where you are following orders from an algorithm. Well, you're privileged. Same here. I don't use it very much, but this morning I got an email from a travel agency for some other conference, and they sent a similar sounding email like 10 minutes after I had responded, as if they hadn't processed the first answer. And I was really confused. Is this now a chatbot or is this a human being? And I wrote back saying, are you a chatbot or a human being? And then they apologized. It was apparently a human being, and I apologized. But AI is coming into more and more areas of work. And as Camil said, I'm very much interested in how work can be understood from a perspective of justice and specifically also democracy. So in earlier stuff, I've done work on what does it actually mean to democratize workplaces directly. I'm happy to say more about this if you like later on. But of course, we cannot ask these questions. Well, we can ask these questions in a void, but if we want to apply them to today's future, we also need to see what's going on, what's out there, what are the developments. And in this debate about the future of work, you see a lot of polarization between people who are very enthusiastic about what AI will do. Some even speak of an end of work in the sense that we'll all have to work far less. I have doubts about that. But there's also a lot of anxiety in the sense that people worry that work will be less meaningful, it will be more unjust than it already is. And there is a big question mark about the chances of democratization in a future of work that is more AI-driven. If the philosophy of work has really exploded in the last 5 years in terms of people turning to work as a topic of philosophical inquiry. And I think one of the reasons is that in thinking about work, so many big philosophical questions really come together. And they come together in a way such that the distinction between abstract theorizing and concrete applied questions doesn't even make sense, because you can have constellations where you have a very concrete constellation, maybe, if you do interdisciplinary work, a passage from an interview with a worker and they speak about freedom, and suddenly you are in a deep debate about what notion of freedom is this. So it's an applied field, but one where really deep questions come up, and that makes it very interesting, of course. A lot of that work happens from perspectives of justice. So there are distributive questions: who benefits, who loses. And there's also a lot of work from a perspective of non-domination in the neo-Republican vein that Skinner and Petitov started, where they think of freedom as non-domination. And of course, work is an area where lots of people would say, well, of course, I stand under someone else's authority in work. So what does non-domination even mean there? And the specific angle that I usually take is the future of democracy, and how can we strengthen, deepen democracy. Lots of people think about democracy as being in crisis these days, and there are good reasons to think that. And so that's sort of the product picture of where I'm coming from. And the argument I will make today is a pretty specific one about how AI will change certain dimensions of the organization of work. It's sort of speculative, so I'm really curious what you think about it. So first, that's the structure of what I'm going to do. First, I say a little bit more about this idea, which in a project title we've called working democracy, namely that if you think about democracy, you also need to think about how work is structured, because democracy today is, at least as an ideal, a society where all people, and so also the working people, have a say in policymaking. And I'll emphasize the socially integrative function of work, that it has, according to many sociologists, at least played in the past. The question is whether it will still play that in the future. Then I zoom in on this famous Wittgensteinian argument about rule following. I'll explain this in a bit more detail. Who has heard about Wittgensteinian rule following before? Okay, so I'll go into some detail maybe. And I think there's a very interesting connection between these arguments about rule following and about the functionalities of AI. And that's what I'll try to explain. And that leads me to my hypothesis, which is that if this mechanism that I described is correct, if you can really see this in real life, lots of work will be polarized between, on the one hand, and those are metaphors. Maybe there are better ones, but I've tried to come up with metaphors. On the one hand, you'll get what I call villages, and I'll explain what I mean. And on the other hand, you'll get what I call protocol jobs, where AI really plays a very dominant role. And then I'll end with thinking about some of the societal implications that might have and what this would mean for the future of democracy. So from broad to narrow and then broad again. If anything is unclear while I'm speaking, please do give me a sign. I might use jargon that not everyone's familiar with. And then afterwards we can have a discussion. So the big picture. As I said, democracies as we think of them today are societies in which working people have a political say. And I emphasize this because historically, this is not at all something you can take for granted. In many historical periods, being a worker in the sense of really doing daily grinding work of maintaining social production, reproduction, basically meant that you couldn't be a ruler. Athenian democracy was an interesting semi-exception. A lot of work was being done by women and slaves and non-citizens who did not have political rights. But Athenian democracy did involve the voices of many citizens who were also workers, like shop owners or tradespeople. And they had specific mechanisms for making sure that these people could actually participate in political decision-making. Of course, it was a very different period, very different type of democracy, but it was a specific challenge for which they devised specific institutional answers. For example, they paid them daily allowances because they could not earn money on the days when they had to participate in political assemblies. Today, we have mostly representative democracy, and the assumption is that people will still find enough time to go voting. But there's still a question about the political voice of working people. Also, if you think about it as a class issue, the working class, is there still such a thing? But somehow these two need to be brought together if you're serious about what we mean by democracy. Now, you might say that at an even more fundamental level, to get the kind of modern societies with a plurality of lifestyles and value systems and so on, you also need some social clues, some social integration. And sociologists from Durkheim onwards have often looked to work as a space where social integration can happen. So privately, people have all kinds of views, tastes, aesthetical ideas. At work, they encounter others, they see complementarities. Even if work is divided, Durkheim thought, in our divided line of work, we see that other people are doing other forms of divided work, and we have to negotiate with them about how the two lines of work fit together. And we see the complementarities, and that all contributes to making us see that we are part of a social whole without having to rely on ideas of sameness and belonging to the same clan or something like that. So Durkheim's idea is very much that work in its modern divided form allows for integration in the face of differences. As a footnote, he also thought that this requires that socioeconomic differences be contained, because otherwise power gets in the way. But this was his vision, and lots of social thinkers after him have implicitly or explicitly assumed something a bit like this. Now, the question is, where does this integration take place in concrete terms? And there's a famous distinction by Coase, the economist, from 1937, where he discusses the relation between, he calls it markets and hierarchies. Markets as in the term as it used today. Hierarchies for him are integrated social structures such as companies, but also public service institutions where you would have a typical bureaucratic integration. So you'd have levels of hierarchy, you'd have roles, you would have rules. Think Max Weber on bureaucratic rule a bit. Now, what Coase argued was that whenever you, think about it from the perspective of a company, you always have to make a decision. Do you hire someone for a certain task, or do you buy that service or that produced good in the market? And Coase argued that this is a matter of the transaction costs. If the transaction costs for market negotiations are high, then it makes sense not to say, let's negotiate this every morning, as it were, between the worker and the buyer of the work, but instead, let's integrate that work into the hierarchy in the sense that the person gets a permanent work contract and they get the money in exchange for being willing to do the work that the company needs for them within certain limits. I mean, you wouldn't then tell people to do something completely out of their competences, but the idea is that you don't have to specify beforehand what exactly the tasks will be. Employment contracts are different from other contracts because they are open-ended in the sense. And that allows the creation of teams that can work together and develop their complementarities without having to have market prices interfere. And this is a natural candidate, let's say, for thinking about where does the social integration actually take place. It takes place at workplaces where people interact with colleagues. It can maybe also to some extent take place in markets when you exchange things with others, but typically market relations are more fleeing, less regular. If you are a prototypical market participant, you react to price, and if your favorite neighborhood store gets too expensive, even though you may have a nice relation with the person there, you would buy elsewhere. Lots of people are different, but that would be typical market behavior. So that social integration at work has its prime place in hierarchies in the sense of integrated workplaces that have internal roles and rules and so on. And the term colleague really describes that social relation at the workplace. Now, it's easy to idealize this from today's perspective, but there are certain potentials if work takes place in these integrated hierarchies. You can have the possibility of integrating minorities. For example, newly arriving migrants, they want to have a job because it gives them money, but also social contacts, networks, a place in society, and so on. Also, I mean, one could say a lot about why women would want to enter workplaces. And in that sense, they were historically a minority, not anymore, of course. But that integrated function of people who were outsiders at first is very important. Then you can also have the creation of shared identities that are independent of things such as skin color or religion or other isms. In Germany, we live in the Ruhr area, which is one of these mining areas where historically from the 19th century onward, you had a lot of migration. But people there really to a strong extent identified as miners. And then the other backgrounds mattered less. I mean, mining is, of course, also the kind of activity where you really need to depend on each other. But that's a phenomenon that you see in different places, that work identities can have the kind of overarching function so that other identities go a bit into the background. And also, when you think about social mobility, often, maybe to some extent a bit more in Europe than in the US, it took place within companies or within public authorities. You climb the ladders, the career ladders, and there are sort of predefined paths that you might take. It's another question whether that's actually a good model, that you always have these pyramids where only a few can really rise to the top, but that's not my topic today. The classical thing was that you would start at the entrance level and then you could work your way up. At least certain groups, and by that I mean that, of course, many of these workplaces were pretty male, white, heterosexual, and so on, but still they offered certain benefits. And the question is what happens if those mechanisms all decline? Because that's what we already see. That brings me to the next slide. Now, just as a brief preliminary, there are, of course, lots of trends going on in the world of work, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. You have questions about globalization, you have other forms of technological change, you have geopolitics coming in. So I'll just bracket this here for a moment. My focus will be on how the organization of work changes. And this is also not specific to specific industries. It's sort of more the logic of how cooperation is institutionally embedded. And here I rely very much on the work of an American legal scholar, a labor law scholar, David Weil. There are others who've done similar work, but I find his conceptualization particularly convincing. And he has analyzed how in the last decades, there has been what he calls a fissuring of workplaces. Now, fissuring in the sense of there being ruptures and breaks and sort of it all disassembles. What does he mean by that? He means that if you enter, say, a hotel these days, you think that the hotel, the building, and the people work there is one organizational unit. At least in the US, you'd be pretty wrong. And also for lots of European chains, you'd be pretty wrong. Cleaning has long been outsourced. Bookkeeping has been outsourced. Lots of other services have been outsourced. The outsourcing companies might outsource further. At the end of the chain, you might get independent or seemingly independent contractors that jump in when other people fall ill. You have temp agencies filling gaps. And why did this happen? And hotels is an industry where it has been very strong. He also discusses telecommunication services and some others. Cost pressures and the possibility of using technologies in order to shift transaction costs and thereby shift the boundaries between hierarchies and markets. Or at least sometimes it's also a shift towards other forms of hierarchies, but often by help of technologies. And he captures these forms of outsourcing, but also phenomena such as franchising, where you have a similar model. So you don't have owners of one restaurant or everyone being employed by the same big company, but instead you have these franchisees, something, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. The people who take a franchise and they carry the risk and they have to follow, and that's where I'm taking that word from, very strict protocols in what they do, but they carry all the risks. So what's happening here is that companies look at their workforce and they ask, which of these really need to be our own employees? And which ones can we outsource? And if you outsource them, how can you ensure that the quality standards will still be there? And for that, often you can use technology. And I've this picture of a GPS code here because GPS tracking is one of the ways in which lots of logistics services have been outsourced. You don't need to have a driver that you employ and where you have a long-term relationship and you can trust them and you have promises that they might develop their careers or whatever. You just control them because you have the GPS and they need to follow the orders from an app about where to go. And that can lead to the disintegration of many workplaces. Weil shows in really quite impressive and drastic and worrying ways that the effects on workers are very bad often. You have lower pay, you have higher health and safety risks because the lead companies, the big names, they would have very clear standards about what the companies need, the outsourced companies need to deliver, but they don't have equally strict standards about health and safety rules. And there are also often lower chances of unionization. So that's connected also to the question of democratization. And sometimes apparently outsourcing was done exactly to prevent unionization. You know, maybe in the US you have company unions, not industry-wide unions. And so apparently this is anecdotal, but he came across cases where companies saw that there were efforts of certain groups of employees to unionize, and in response they outsourced them. And then you have a more fractured workforce where these different subcontracting companies are under cost pressure because there are several of them competing for the contract with the lead company, lowest wages. And then they often pass on these pressures to even further contractors down the Fisher chain. Okay, this hasn't happened to quite the same extent in Europe, from what I know, but to some extent also. And I mean, one interesting question is which labor laws or which mechanisms precisely can actually prevent this in the current environment. But the reason why I'm giving you this rather detailed picture is that when AI comes into play, I think what we must expect is an even further fissuring and fracturing of the work organization. And to make that argument, Wittgenstein comes in. So you have to bear with me for a bit for the philosophical argument here. So Wittgenstein has a famous discussion in the philosophical investigations on rule following. What does it mean to follow a rule? And that's one of these things where everyone thinks, oh yeah, we know what it means to follow a rule, but once you start questioning, it gets really interesting. And he argues basically that to understand what it actually means to go on following a rule from now into the future, we need to have an understanding of the social practices in which the rules are grounded. And he starts this with a slightly crazy example. So he has this thought experiment of a pupil, a kid that is taught to do some maths. And this kid is taught to do a line of +2. And they get to 1,000. So they do 996, 998, 1,000, correct? And then they go on 1,000, 1,004, 1,008, 1,012, and they think they're doing the right thing and following the rule. So the quote is saying, I thought that was how I was meant to do it. And then there's a dialogue between the teacher and the kid. The kid somehow thought that when you get to numbers that have 4 numbers in them, like 1,000 in contrast to 999, then the rule changes to +4. For whatever reason, they got this idea. He doesn't explain. And Wittgenstein brings in this example in order to make an argument that it's often far less obvious how a rule continues into the future than we tend to think when we are embedded in a social context that gives us sufficient cues about how to do this. So he says, how can a rule show me what I have to do at this point? Whatever I do is on some interpretation in accord with the rule. So you could find some kind of interpretation, maybe in the +2 example, it's a bit crazy, but you could say, yeah, maybe the +2 meant +2 until 999 and then something else. And what Wittgenstein here wants to say is that rule following, it's a normative activity in the first place, so that you can get it right, you can get it wrong. But it needs to be undergirded by these social practices and the social recognition. So you need to have others who tell you that was a wrong application of the rule to understand what it means to continue. So in that sense, if you want a slogan, you could say every application is in a way an interpretation. And there's a spectrum from very simple cases that are very clear to very ambiguous cases where there are really many different interpretations of what a rule could mean, and you could make a case for any of these interpretations. So here is how I want to connect this to the organization of work. I think that we can think of work organizations as social spaces in which people interpret rules together in order to fulfill certain tasks. So not because they want to follow rules, but because they need rules to coordinate their behavior. And the rules are meant to guide them towards a certain purpose. Teaching, caring for the sick, producing a certain good, selling something, whatever. And in organizational sociology, there is a very broad consensus that the formal rules of organizations and the lived practices are not quite the same, and it would be very naive to assume that organizations function as the rule book says. And rules can often be contradictory, or they are ambiguous, or they don't apply to new cases. And one indication for that is that when you come to work in a new organization, of course you can read the rule books, but what you really need is someone who guides you and tells you how this really works in practice. What do you do if there are two rules and they seem to conflict, which one has priority? What do you do if there seems to be a gap in the rules, and so on? Also, often it's not very efficient that you try to read all the rules because you don't know which ones are really relevant for what you need to do. So many organizations very sensibly have human beings to onboard new colleagues, not just rule books. If one takes this idea seriously, that you need the social practices in organizations for understanding what's going on, how the rules are supposed to be followed, then that gives you a certain perspective on what it means to work together in an organization. Namely, you get a focus on what you could call local knowledge, the social routines in a particular place. One illustration of that point could be if you have bigger companies that are still not fissured, and you have different branches, they have the same formal rules, but how they do things, the work culture can be quite different in different branches. So if you get to work for them, you need to know the culture in the particular branch where you're working. And that also means focusing on the collegial community. And one term from organizational sociology that I like in this respect is that it's a negotiated order. People together negotiate what the rules mean. Of course, if you have a hierarchical organization, there's a certain priority for interpretations that come from the top. But an important and interesting point here is that often you cannot completely enforce interpretations top down. To a certain extent, it's a matter of people actually doing the work, how they interpret things, how they go on with the rule, what that means in new cases, and also how they provide social recognition for it or refuse it. And that can, in many cases, be a power resource for the employees because they really have the knowledge on the ground. They are the ones who can socialize the newcomers and explain to them what's going on. they are the ones who need to interpret new rules that are being made. And so you can, of course, impose things on them, but if you want them to do the actual work, then you need to also let them apply the rules, and then that automatically brings a certain space of interpretation. At least that would be the picture before AI comes in, and maybe you're already seeing where this is all getting. Now, digital technologies can help to provide more fine-grained rules, and when AI comes in, it can be even more fine-grained. What do I mean by this? Very briefly, I'm pretty sure that most people are familiar with this. What does AI typically do? You have big data sets that show you patterns from the past. For example, you have picture data sets about what counts as a traffic light. You know, when you have to log in somewhere and you have to prove that you're a human, you're actually doing free work for these companies. But lots of other examples as well. You have algorithms that make predictions on what the right continuation based on the big data is, and they get learned, they get trained in the sense that they get feedback on whether they gave the right or the wrong answer, till they get sufficiently good at making predictions that go the right way. And depending on, typically from, I mean, I'm not an IT expert, obviously, I've read about these things, but if it's a neural network, it's a self-learning process where it's not a pre-programmed sort of linear thing, even very complex one, but it's recursive loops. And even the programmers may not know how exactly the AI does it, but that doesn't mean it cannot give you reliable results. Here's a short, fun example that I read about once. There was an AI that was trained, I think it was a couple of years ago. It was supposed to distinguish pictures of horses and other animals. And it got pretty good at it. And so then the programmers tried to understand what it actually did. And they could re-engineer the fact that it would always look at the bottom right corner of the horse pictures. And then they got confused about what's it about that corner of the pictures. Turned out they had bought the horse pictures from a certain database that always had its logo in this corner. And the AI very cleverly discovered that all pictures with horses have that logo. And so it could make perfect predictions, but based on a completely artificial random criterion, because of course in the wild, not all horse pictures have a logo. So that's the kind of ignorance that you get, but it doesn't mean it can't work in practice. Often you don't need to open the black box. So that's the general principle. And insofar as you can get good data on what happened in the past, you can predict what it means to go on. If, and that's an important if your goal is really just to continue the pattern, then you have far less need for local knowledge. You don't need the colleagues telling each other. You can have, for example, a chatbot that would tell people what to do. You could support them in making the right choices based on all the data that have been collected from the past work of other people in that company or network or whatever. But the support side is sort of the nice face of this. The maybe less nice side is the control side, the surveillance side. So you get what's called then in the literature algorithmic management, where it becomes far less necessary to integrate people into a network of other human beings, an organization in the classical sense, as long as you can give them what they need through a program. And in that sense, you can imagine that their job really becomes much more just a matter of, I've put it, the quote, punching buttons here. That's a quote from an ethnography of a very highly automated bakery already long before the arrival of AI, where these bakers said, we are here just punching buttons. At home, we are really bakers. We're making cakes, we're making bread. Here, we are just punching buttons. And you can very well imagine that with the advance of AI, that punching buttons pattern will also become applicable to, for example, many forms of banking conversations, insurance companies. A lot of that has already been automated, but insofar as there's still human contact, what you often get is people sitting behind a screen, filling in the answers that the client gives, and then putting on submit, and then they get an answer and they read out the answer. So in that sense, it's not their own judgment or anything. There might be advantages in terms of procedural justice. That's an issue we could discuss. But for the person doing it, it's punching buttons and not having really a meaningful conversation and a risk estimate and what have you. Now, you might say, does this matter if it's just a step towards full automation? And I think for certain jobs, that's true. Some of these desk jobs will really be completely machine run in the very near future. Some of them already are. But you also have many jobs where it's not that easy because you still have some manual elements, or you still have trouble getting all the data right. So you still need someone to check. And then you get work that is really, I mean, you could say whether that's, to use the Marxist term, really just the human as an appendage of the machine here. And that leads me to that metaphor, the two metaphors in my title, namely, what will this mean for the future of work? Now, importantly, I think this will not hold for all forms of work. There will continue to be jobs that require creativity, collaboration. Someone needs to program the algorithms or tell them what goals to pursue. Think of the people who design the menus for fast food restaurants in contrast to the people who then work at the fast food restaurants. Or certain forms of luxury provision, so not the chain hotel, but the boutique hotel. In these places, work would continue to be organized according to an own setting of the rules by those who do the work. And in those places, I've used the village metaphor because I want to express both the closeness, but also maybe the fact that there's something a bit narrow and constraining. Because my assumption would be that you really have to be socialized into those, and you really, because there's a contrast now with the more protocol jobs, and those become really sort of islands of own rule setting, where the social life also matters a lot. And you need to be part of things. And when I say villages, I don't mean that it can be only local. It can be global in the sense that people are in lots of different places, but they're still very interconnected. And they think of themselves as part of a community. They share certain values. They, as I say, interpret the rules of what it means to do good work together. But those kinds of jobs will be very different from what I call the protocol jobs, where the rules are set by others. And you have algorithmic surveillance instead of local knowledge, no right for the workers to interpret the rules together, but a very far-reaching dominance of an interpretation that comes from the AI that continues the patterns from the past. In the extreme case, you would not need colleagues in this because the AI tells you what to do. And all of the collegiality, the joint problem solving, the fun that people have together, that's just contingent. I mean, sometimes companies might see that people are not very productive if you don't let them work in groups, and then they might allow them to have colleagues in the sense that there are several people in one place. But the relation would also be different because you wouldn't be doing something together and maybe also learn from each other, deliberate on how you interpret the rules and so on. You'd just sort of follow the algorithm in parallel. And often in these algorithmic systems, you'd also be ranked. And in that sense, you'd be competing with each other because they tend to rank workers in order to also incentivize them to want to get higher in the ranks and so on. But that means that your colleagues are really, they're not colleagues in the classic sense. They are, in a sense, just contingent co-workers competing for better rankings with you on the same platform. And you might say, well, maybe lots of jobs are already a mixture of both, and maybe they will stay mixtures of both. I think there's some truth in that, but I think there's also a reason to think that they will be driven apart. And that's because what you see in lots of jobs is that simple tasks done by highly paid people get outsourced because it's inefficient for a company to pay someone who has a high pay scale to do a task that can also be done by someone on a lower pay scale. For Bages' law in the history of economics. For example, when you have consultants sending this the sketches of their PowerPoint slides presentations to people in India, who then overnight do the presentations, and the next morning, I mean, works with the time zones, it gets sent back to the consultants. That's cheaper than having the consultants do the slides themselves. And in a similar way, if insofar as you have protocolizable tasks in villages, unless there are countervailing reasons, it's pretty likely that they would just outsource those to protocolizable, to protocoled jobs that would be run in some other way. So that's the negative picture, and that's what I hope you'll show me wrong about. But assuming this is the case, and this brings me to my last part, let me think a little bit about the societal implications. If this mechanism of how algorithms can replace social rule-following activities is true, then we could get a kind of fissuring on steroids, in the sense that far more activities can be fissured because it's not necessary for companies to keep people together in teams anymore. You can outsource, you can maybe have far more remote work, insofar as it's work done on computers in the broadest sense. And it could be pretty lonely in many cases. It's also interesting what it means for access to opportunities. What I think one can see is that it will be easier to change jobs between the protocols and to access these protocol jobs. Why? Because you don't need to know anything. You just follow the algorithm. You just, if it's a highly protocol job. But it might get far more difficult to then make the transition from a protocol job into a village job, because for that you need to be socialized into it. And again, this is anecdotal, but one interesting thing that I see in many cities in Europe, in Groningen is very visible, is that these delivery cyclists, they are almost never Dutch people. They tend to be migrants, and it's logical why this happens. You don't need to speak Dutch. You don't need to know a lot. You get an app. You follow the orders, and you just earn a bit of money. And if you do this a few hours a week as a side job, maybe that's not even such a big problem. The problem is, can you expect to get from that kind of work into something else? Also, it doesn't give you the same integration into a group of colleagues that jobs that lots of migrants traditionally did would give you. Because it's just you and the app, and if you're lucky, there's a hangout place where you meet a few other drivers or cyclists. But there's not that kind of social integration. And from that kind of job, what would it even mean to rise in the ranks? You could maybe do some other protocol or work on a different platform, but there's no natural learning process. There's no sense of really getting better at it, becoming the one who teaches other colleagues about how to do things. That all just doesn't happen anymore. Also, interesting questions about gender justice. And what I'm thinking here in particular is that insofar as women are still doing more family work, and therefore have phases in their life where they're less available for the labor market, that might make it difficult to stay in villages or even get into villages in the first place. And they might then think, oh, for a little bit, I'll do some kind of protocol job. But they might then have trouble entering the village side of things ever again. I mentioned the social integration of migrants already. Here on the slide, I also say, if not at work, then where? And that's not meant in a purely rhetorical work. There might be other spaces for social integration. But insofar as historically work has played a big role there, and work doesn't do it anymore, we need to ask urgent questions about, okay, where else are people supposed to be to get these integrative experiences? And at a more fundamental level, we can also really ask, what does this mean for democracy in the sense of people living together in a society, and they're meant to think of each other as moral equals and co-legislators of the rules of their society, when their work experience is so different. And you already sometimes hear remarks about AI feudalism, and often it's meant in the sense of the owners of AIs or robots or whatever versus the rest who gets unemployed. But if the villages protocols picture is correct, then even within those who have to work for a living, you still get very, very different work experiences. And that also has something feudal in a way. My last slide. What are the democratic policy questions that arise out of this? I mean, this is potentially open-ended, so I'll just give a few things here. There are really questions about minimum standards for decent work. I mean, many constitutions, I don't know about the Spanish one, but many national constitutions have decent work in their list of things that they want to guarantee to citizens. It's a human right. It's in all the official documents. But what does it actually mean under conditions of fissuring and AI and gig work, whatever? What about minimum pay? Could there maybe be something such as a right to have colleagues? So should companies maybe have to provide spaces or possibilities of contacting others who do similar work and also provide them with certain social activities? Another argument that's interesting in this context is whether there could be policies that focus on mid-skilled jobs in the sense that you create bridges from the protocolled to other types of jobs. And yeah, that would require also changes in how training is organized, what opportunities people have mid-career to start afresh, as it were, learn something new. In Austria, you have the right to take a leave for further training. That's something that seems very relevant when you think about these scenarios. So there are things that could be done really in a classical policy sense, so the government could take certain steps that might help in this regard. But there are also questions about bottom-up reactions. And the question is whether governments will do anything unless they are pushed from somewhere. So one interesting question here is also, what kind of working class organization and democratic work representation do you have? Who is the voice of these protocolled workers in politics? Who speaks for them? Do the classical unions take them on board? Do they organize differently? There have been quite a few strikes of delivery cyclists that were done completely independent from any unions. They organize it via social media and chat groups and so on. But there are also attempts to get union capacity and the organizing activities of these groups together, find synergies, help each other. But that's still very much in the making. There are also questions about what it would mean to have participatory and representative elements of democracy in these different work forms. By participatory, I mean that people really participate in decision-making. And that's pretty easy to imagine for the villages, in the sense that in villages, I mean, it's not a necessary feature. They can also be pretty hierarchical in a kind of master-apprentice relation. But you can also imagine that they benefit from having all the different voices, and you have epistemic knowledge advantages from democratic participation. For protocolled work, I find it very hard to think about what would it mean to democratize these protocols. But I think it would have to include representation of workers' voices in the decision-making bodies that write the protocols some way or another. So it would be more a model of some kind of representative democracy, but you'd have to think very well about what are the power structures and how could you really get sufficient maybe veto power or whatever. Then a topic that I already mentioned, if work doesn't do the integration job that it to some extent did in the past anymore, what else do we have? And do people have time for engaging in these other activities? I mean, people speak a lot about civil society and sports clubs are so important. And oh, it's so nice if people sing in choirs. All fine. Bob Tallis had this book on, he called it, what was it? Not something like not too much democracy or something. But what we actually meant was let's have social spaces where people can get together and not talk about politics, but just talk about other things so that they can see that there's more than just in the US, the Republican Democrat contrast. And that's a very nice proposal, but it's a very middle class proposal in the sense that who has the time to do these, especially if you also have family life. So if you really want to push that line, I think you need to combine it with proposals for work time reduction. And that raises material questions again. How many hours do you need to work to make a living? Could we have a 4-day work week in the future? Because in the end, these algorithms are productive for certain things, but who gets the productivity gains? Bigger topic that I just want to briefly touch here is, could we also think about something like what I would call time for democracy, in the sense that people gain time from paid work, but would get encouraged. I'm not in favor of mandatory things here, although some arguments are quite strong, but I'm personally not yet convinced. But sort of nudges and incentives to participate in civic activities. So local activities to take care of the environment or social work. I mean, if you think about your neighborhood, I'm sure you can immediately think of things that people could do together that would be good to be done, but no one has time for them. Ultimately, what this all raises are really questions about what kind of division of labor between humans and robots or algorithms do we want? And that also leads to a question that's very difficult to raise when you talk to economists. In philosophy, it's a bit more common, namely about whether there might be forms of work that are valuable not only in an instrumental sense, in the sense of what they produce, what the outcome is, but that also have some intrinsic value to the people who do them. But then again, you might ask, well, but as a society, are we willing to pay for these people to get the intrinsic value of their work? Or is it kind of a luxury thing that only a few groups want to have, and should the rest of society have to subsidize them? So I think there, as I said at the beginning, that you can move very fast from very applied to very deep questions here. And I'm very curious what you all think about this, and I hope you have some arguments that will give me some more optimism. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now it's the time for questions, maybe.
Yeah, Lisa, the way we do it typically is you will take 2 questions and then answer them, and then we go to the next 2. It seems to work really well. Yeah. And I've been lately allowing the chair to phrase the first question. Yeah, why not?
So, well, I've been writing down some questions. First is well, about Wittgenstein, because that features so prominently, and I'm a little bit unsure that Wittgenstein here brings something, let's say, new with respect to what you know. This is the first doubt. Yeah, we interpret rules. So what? But the second, maybe more, maybe deeper, a deeper concern is that if you think of organization from the perspective of democracy, and it's actually what we do, we really need to go beyond an understanding of rule following that is Wittgensteinian. That is an understanding that is not simply conventionalist and interpretativist, but an understanding that is more critical theoretical. That puts at the core of the understanding of rules questions such as power, or questions such as truth, right? Depending on let's say the game, the organizational game that it is played, right? So yeah, I find it potentially insufficient to just focus on Wittgenstein. So, even authors like Habermas or Derrida and their understanding of rules that incorporates what Habermas called transcendence from within, with reference to the questions of justice or truth, depending again on the type of organizational and social game that is played out, seem to be potentially more fruitful. So I leave it with that, because you said one question. So I have other questions, but Yeah, we take two, no, you said, or yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa, for your very interesting talk. I too had sort of 3 or 4 questions, but I'll just ask one that has to do with where you ended up, but also where you started, where you just suggested that we link this crisis in work related to AI with the crisis in democracy. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were, or if you had done any work on specifically the connection between this fissuring or fracturing on steroids, as you say, of the workplace, which I would claim is also a neoliberalism on steroids, associated with this idea of atomization as a vehicle for productivity that creates its own problems that then require a constant coming back together, sort of motivation seminars, esprit de corps building, in order to counteract this atomization. But that would have been one of the other questions. The question I wanted to ask you was, do you see so much of what is happening today in terms of the return to issues of sovereignty, of borders, of re-territorialization, the tribalism that we are currently experiencing as a certain longing for the village in the face of this hyper-protocolization of our existence. So in a way, my question is, aren't there sort of, to use, I think, a word that is adequate here, but aren't some of the fascistic sort of tendencies that we see today not, I would say, not exclusively, but also partly a reaction to this atomization, fissuring, or fracturing of the work and the socializing role that I think you're right, it had, going back to the 19th century, and it is sort of disappearing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So you had sort of 2 questions that I think they are related in a way, but the first was, can we only make this argument with Wittgenstein? Sort of, not if you don't want to. I think you could also find a language of, for example, organizational routines is a term that a sociology friend mentioned to me, and then I looked up, there's some literature on that. So you don't need Wittgenstein here if you don't want him. I had these ideas thinking about Wittgenstein, and that's why, at least so far, I've kept Wittgenstein in the paper, even though it, brings together things in a way that makes it maybe less conventional than lots of academic writing proceeds these days. The second question you're raising, I fully agree that if we want to have really democratic organizations, we need more than interpreting the rules together. But my point is sort of logically one step before that. If the workers cannot even interpret the rules together anymore, not even, how do we best take care of that patient in a hospital? Do we deliberate together? Do we exchange views, experiences, try something, react sort of as a kind of team approach? If not even that can happen in a very functional and goal-directed way, then the further things that you're rightly bringing in don't have a chance of getting off the ground at all. So in that sense, and maybe one thing that your question reminds me of is that I don't want to say that AI is the only pressure on the joint rule following. And you said neoliberalism. I mean, the cost pressure on public institutions such as hospitals has also changed the way they work in ways that has made a lot of that team orientation already very fragile or threatened. So in that sense, I fully agree. And then the question is this, how to sort of place this in the very big picture. I mean, I would say that the fascist promise of community it's a pseudo promise in the sense that it's not saying we will rebuild local communities. We will bring, well, I mean, sometimes you get the voice of we will bring back certain kinds of jobs. You could argue that instead of that, it promises a national community that then has to purify all foreign elements instead of going the Durkheimian road of saying we need community, we need complementarity, we need solidarity, but out of difference, because difference is just, for Durkheim at least, a key feature of modernity. So in that sense, I would say that they do get at a certain longing, but what they promise is actually something else and something worse, you could maybe even argue. Of course, I wasn't assuming that, but I think there's also something which I haven't really fully included in the paper and in the talk now, but it was sort of also on my mind when thinking about this, which is the kind of attack on your self-respect and your self-image if you become a protocol worker. You're not an active contributor. You don't have a lot of agency. And I think there might be an interesting question here about the extent to which this is also specifically perceived as an attack on a certain construction of masculinity. But I don't know whether that would stand up if one really thinks it through, but it could be a hypothesis that if you have a certain idea of, say, certain craft work, like the builder as a stereotypical male occupation, and then instead you have to become a McDonald's worker, and you have the seconds are counted for how much time you're allowed to spend on one hamburger. That might feel as an attack on not only your autonomy and agency in general, but also maybe to some extent on your gender identity. So I think there are interesting interrelations. I haven't seen what one might actually want to study empirically, quantitatively. Are people in Fischer jobs particularly likely to vote in a certain way? That would be very interesting. I would venture the guess that it would be interesting to not only look at people who are actually experiencing certain things, but also at people who are threatened by certain things. Because what I do know from empirical colleagues is that a lot of right populist votes come from people who are not themselves the most disadvantaged members of society, but who fear that they will fall, as it were. And I think the fear of falling, what does it mean concretely? It can, for example, mean that you fear that your job will be cut and then you have to work for one of those protocoled or outsourced companies. So in that sense, I think there are lots of connections, and I'm sure you could explore them empirically, and my hypothesis would be that there are correlations you could find, but I don't know. That would be an interesting empirical project.
And then I have one.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. It brought back a couple of memories from a more, let's say, radical youth. So maybe I present a kind of idea that's a bit more positive. I want to ask a question about dignity. Mm-hmm. And it kind of tacks onto what you were saying right at the end there. Because when I was in my undergraduate in London, I did translation for unions who were basically startup unions who were not registered as unions, but in practice functioned as them. And they were mainly involving I did my undergraduate at SOAS, and we had a very long campaign, which was called the Justice for Cleaners campaign.
Yeah.
And this came from migrant labourers from South America. Started when they were all locked up in a room one day, and 8 or something were deported. Basically, it was in collusion with the management of the university. And anyway, so this campaign started. And these startup unions, what they provided, I think, was a space often for people who were working in protocol jobs, which I think I really like the analogy, as a kind of almost a socialization space. So this was instead doing the function that work would have done in the traditional picture, but it provided a space for parties, for even though there were always fundraisers and social and cultural events, but it was all tied into the act of resistance. So I don't know to what extent dignity and socialization in these protocol jobs can be moved out of the actual act of labor and into a form of resistance. Thank you.
So I don't know how to articulate my observation. First of all, I wanted to say as a non-philosopher, I'm a social psychologist who studies social integration. I buy very much the dangers of artificial intelligence in the workplace as a way, as fissuring those jobs and workplaces that basically prevent individuals from being socially integrated. And I really like your question. So if they don't socially integrate at work, so what? And where are they going to do it? Okay. So it's going to sound like I have two questions, but I don't. So I wanted to share with you that the observation I've been having lately, which is in my residence, in my street, there are a lot of restaurants. And right before the restaurants open, you have all those overeat, delivery, individuals, which of course are all migrant workers, waiting for the restaurants to open. And they hang out and they socialize. And they sit on benches and they talk. And I always like to see that, but I also worry that that's the only moment they can socialize, because then they're going to, leave and work for who knows how many hours. So, and I will end that observation because I think that is an example of an extreme, case of the sort of spatial challenges that this is bringing to society. But I have a friend who is the top level worker for a company and was sort of semi-laid out during COVID when we had the, when we locked up for 3 months at home in Spain. But those workers were allowed to deliver food. They Uber Eats. So he got a job at Uber Eats. He's a top level professional. He's a computer scientist. And for 2 or 3 months, he did that. And he said it saved his mental health. He loved to be able to be out. He loved interacting with all those other people. He said, so it's just the paradox of how, I don't have a point with the anecdote at the end. It's more like, in a way, they are in such a precarious situation and yet they're getting exercise. And my friend who is in a privileged position was able to benefit from that for 2 months, go back to his work. And, in a way, we thought you're cheating because you're not one of them. Why are you doing this for 2 months, right? But anyway, I like to share that anecdote with you, just because it kind of shows both the privilege of the second person and the precarity of the first. It wasn't a question, it was an observation.
Well, thank you. So let me start with the justice for cleaners. I mean, yes, absolutely. There are cases like this. There's also a very interesting book on yet another extreme form of digitalized work on Amazon Mechanical Turk and ghost work, it's called. Highly recommended. Great ethnography. And those are the most isolated workers you can imagine because they just sit behind their computers anywhere in the world and they do these micro tasks on this digital platform and they also compete with each other. But they find ways of communicating and they have platforms where they log in the morning and say hi to the colleagues. And they, at one point, also wrote a letter to Bezos, the Amazon boss, together without any effect, unfortunately. But so in that sense, you could say seems to be a kind of human ability to resist, to build networks, to find others that can thrive in the most unexpected places. But that's a bit like saying, even in a dictatorial regime in the prison, people will stick together. So in that sense, it's not a way to think about how should society be organized. It's giving me hope in the sense that people are still doing these things under the most adverse circumstances and in really fragile conditions. But it also speaks to the need, and I mean the risk that they are taking with us in some cases, speaks to the human need to have this kind of connection. And so in that sense, I mean, you have this whole post-work literature that really says we should only ever opt for those things to happen, for dignity to be reaffirmed, sociability to be practiced outside of work. But I'm not convinced yet that we are at a point in history where this is the right strategy, just because it doesn't look like bad work will go away for so many people for decades to come. And so therefore, I'm not willing to sort of theoretically give up the workspace as a place where people should also have opportunities for that. On the delivery cyclists, I mean, yes, you said it's not a question, but let me briefly try to react. It's an interesting anecdote because it does show that that some of these jobs, maybe not all of them, some of them do have advantages. And you mentioned the exercise. And there is a line in the philosophy of work, especially in France, that really also emphasizes the health effects of work much more, in the sense that human beings have not evolved to just sit behind screens. And you know, if you have a job where you sit behind the screen, you need to find exercise elsewhere. And they also try to think much more about really the social health effects of how we work these days. And that interestingly also leads them very much to more participatory forms of work and more respect, more dignity. So you can get at these arguments from many different angles. But then you could also say, well, that still doesn't, it would be even better if they had the cycling and they had a right to a shared space and they had some right to maybe get certain trainings, maybe, you know, develop their skills in certain ways, maybe move to other roles from that entrance level role. So this is not an either or. And in that sense, yeah, I see the, yeah.
So challenges that this is bringing and how they need to be addressed. So yes, every time I see them all together, I think they need to be given. It'd be nice if they had a space for them, if they had a place where they could gather.
And it's a matter of money. The companies are not willing to spend money on that. And they do it if in other companies they think there's value in people hanging out together. That's why you have these office spaces and swimming pools or whatever at Google, because they think that makes their workers more creative. Mm-hmm. That would be then a more village kind of scenario.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I feel sorry because I think that my observation might be even more pessimistic about future. And regarding future, I didn't see that, I saw that you probably didn't make this distinction. You didn't mention the dimension of robotics linked to AI. And what I was thinking about is that probably this division of labor that you described between villages and protocol workers can be suddenly outclassed by progresses in intersections and integration of AI robotics. Maybe what we are going through is a future division of labor between village laborers and a mass of unoccupied people. And I think that this poses very serious questions to current democratic regimes, and it poses again the issue of conflict of power, in the political sense, but also in the economic sense. There are issues like all the wealth that will be produced by this new economy in societies with a mass of unoccupied people. There are still classic capitalistic ways of accumulate wealth in oligopolies and monopolies of people, but there are no more ways of integrating people by the social dimension of work. So we will have a world in which we have workplaces, but we don't have probably workforce anymore. And this poses very serious questions for political power. So how you deal with this new scenario, how you guarantee ways of social recognition and social inclusions, and also how you can counteract the power of capitalist accumulation, which may be in the future, and even nowadays probably it's already a very serious problem for political power. So this was my question for you is what do you think about these possible issues and this future scenario? If you are more optimistic than me, because I'm quite not.
Any other questions? Yes, there are two there. Maybe you should take them together. Yeah, since we have some 7. Miguel, you want to also ask another question? Okay, we'll leave the others.
Hello. I have a question which is related about. Sorry. I can stand up. Maybe I'm short, so. So my question is that there's a lot of discussions today about how AI still reproduces many stereotypes and prejudices coming from like white and men, so like gender stereotypes and stereotypes about minorities are reproduced with AI. And like, how do you think this combined with this idea or prospects of having protocols where maybe migrants or minorities or women would more likely end up, would there be like some sort of double disadvantage or double stereotyping in combining this, where like this minority groups or these disadvantaged groups could not get to the way, like not get a way to influence AI algorithm in a sense that it makes it more inclusive in a sense of, and the impact on democracy as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I can? Okay. So I'm personally not yet convinced that so many things can be robotized, and also that you would not see the development of new tasks. So I don't think that mass unemployment is on the horizon. I think there is some potential for work time reduction, but that's a political project. And maybe some unemployment and transitional unemployment, in the sense that certain jobs you'll just need fewer people, and then certain generations will not be able to get retrained. So I think that, for me, that's the more likely empirical scenario, just looking at the history of technological progress and so on. But let's run with it for a moment. So I think a key question would be, what kind of economic power could this mass of unemployed people exercise? Because as workers, they can at least still exercise the power of withdrawing their work. So the strike, or also the general strike, and Alex Gurevich has a book coming out on why you need to return to thinking about strikes more actively, and he's very much making this line that this is a way of resisting certain forms of power, and unemployed people don't have this. And so the question then is, what kind of involvement, what kind of possibilities do they have? I mean, they have one resource that lots of others don't have, which is potentially time. So these examples of organizing, they sometimes, I'm thinking of one concrete example I heard about, they got triggered when some people got dismissed. So there was a sense of injustice, but the dismissed person also then had the time to get others together. And then so this is a kind of paradoxical thing, but these unemployed masses, unless they have become totally passive, no, but insofar as they are still active, that could be at least some potential. I think this is also an interesting question to connect with the whole discussion about unconditional basic income, and what power, what possibilities would people with an unconditional basic income have. I was first pretty positive about unconditional basic income. I got much more skeptical when I heard that many Silicon Valley bosses endorse it because they don't want themselves to pay for the people who get unemployed. They want the government to take care of them. And ultimately, the tax income for an unconditional basic income in such a scenario would, to a great extent, have to be raised from the companies that own the robots. And what kind of power dynamics do you then get? So that is indeed a bleak scenario. As I said, I don't think it's so likely because I think robotics is not there yet, but it might well happen over a few decades. Double disadvantage, I fear you are right. I haven't included that discussion here just for reasons of space, but the biases are well known. And the biases are such that if you want, you can do lots of things with the data, with the algorithms to correct for the biases. And it's quite interesting that what's going on in the US at the moment, all the anti-diversity, equity, inclusion measures, some companies have really run with this and others have said, no, we think it's still important. And that will probably also have an effect on what will happen to how AI is being used in the future. Will they still do checks for gender justice, justice towards different ethnic groups and so on, different linguistic groups also. So you can take many steps on the technical side if you want to, or if the companies are legally forced to take steps. You can get some of, most of, depends a bit on the kind of case study you have in mind, but lots of the biases can be fixed if you really want to. But that takes a political will. And we see this attack on all these groups anyway. And so this is playing into each other at the moment. And that does indeed then create the risk that you're describing, that the algorithms are already biased and then certain groups are already more likely to have to work under them. Yes, I wish I had a different answer.
We take one more question or no?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions. I can take the last question here if the person.
No, if you come.
Just come to me. Because some people might have to run, but you can just come to me. Yeah.